Good afternoon. This is, I believe, the final meeting of the Ways and Means Committee for this biennium. It is May 29th. I still have no idea what date it is until I look at this piece of paper. I'm glad that I've been consistent for 2 years. And it's 2:22, and we are doing a walkthrough of the final conference committee report on H949, the yield bill. We have spent time on this every week since January, and I'm glad that we get to gather again to do this, despite the very large room. Julia, hello. So nice to see you. Can you take us through the bill via fiscal note or Outlook or whatever you prefer to start with?
Sure, absolutely. Julia Richards, fiscal office. Do you want me to share my screen?
Yes, please.
Let me just make sure. So there are a number of documents posted on the committee page under my name. I think it probably makes sense to start with the Outlook, or sorry, start with fiscal note.
And we're getting paper copies of the fiscal note, but there's a paper jam in the copy room, and so they'll be here soon.
In the meantime,
Somehow has one.
I believe that I just need to wait for Sorcha to turn on sharing. Oh, do you want me to just start walking you through it?
Look, there she is.
Oh, perfect.
We can pass them down. Thank you. I really feel sure. Yeah, that one.
Okay. So walking through the fiscal note, and we can pivot to, there are 4 documents on the committee page under my name. There's the fiscal note, there's the education fund outlook, and then there's the 2 spreadsheets that were discussed by Rep. Kimball on the floor this morning during the caucus of the whole. So just gonna go deep into each section. So section 1, this is setting the yields and the rates. The construct that the Committee of Conference landed on was to use the 100.9 million of one-time general fund money, all in fiscal year 2027, to uniformly lower property tax bills. Pivoting to the education fund outlook, I put together here the column B. This is reflecting what was passed out of the House. You'll recall that the House construct was to apply half of the 104.9 million of one-time general fund to uniformly lower property taxes and reserving the other half for buying down property taxes in the following year. The Senate construct was to use the 100.9 million in general fund to uniformly lower property taxes in a single year. The difference in that 104.9 versus the 100.9 million of general fund has to do with the one-time expansion of the renter credit, right? So the Senate proposal had the one-time expansion of the renter credit, which was estimated to cost 4 million in FY27. And this was what was adopted by the Committee of Conference. So 100.9 million used to uniformly lower rates in or uniformly lower bills in FY27, and 4 million to the renter credit. What we can see here in column D is the Committee of Conference report. So you can see the corresponding yields and rate, which would result in an estimated average uniform bill change of 3.5%. Right, so that's across homestead, non-homestead, and income sensitized property taxpayers. The latest education spending information that we have is that education spending is estimated to grow by 3.8% between FY 26 and FY 27. Moving down, we can see the underlying policy decisions that inform those yields. The 933 purchase and use and meals and rooms change. And then, of course, the one-time general fund transfer of 100.9. We see the, we haven't gone here yet, but the 949, the TIF payment that you voted out of Ways and Means still is within this construct. You can see no money is put towards additional reserves. However, the stabilization reserve is fully funded. So that is the yield construct as reported by the Committee of Conference.
Thank you so much. Very helpful to get this. So the final rate is lower than what people expected when they voted on budgets, because the final rate post buy down is 3.5 and total ed spending is up 3.8%.
I don't know what voters were told when they voted on their budgets. Each school district, each school board decides to use a different field. It is lower than what was forecasted in the December 1 letter.
Can you guesstimate, and obviously so many things change, so anything's a guesstimate. Can you guesstimate what the impact of using $100 million this year is on budgeting process next year?
I can't speak to how it will impact school board budgeting processes. What we do know is that using one-time money in 1 year means that the overall property tax burden is sort of artificially lowered or lowered one time, meaning that in the following year, we not only will need to make up the difference from that buy down, but then however much is grown on top of that. So we'll see a larger increase year over year without additional one-time money.
Is that something we can get modeling of based on prior, I mean, what impact that's likely to have on tax rates next year? I mean, what I'm mindful of is every year, we started this year talking about digit increases in tax rates, and school spending only went up 3.9%. And then now it's going to be 3.5%. No one's going to remember that. They're just going to remember how fast ed spending is growing. We're going to start next year with the same narrative. And I'm just wondering, is there some way to educate people about that in the public? So we have to have that data.
With respect to how school board will respond, I don't know. I did present the modeling in this committee about a month ago that showed the different impacts of different buy down amounts using a whole host of assumptions. And I believe I also wrote a memo to the speaker that's posted on the speaker's website. Beyond that, I don't know what else we could do.
Thanks, Julia. Anyone else have any questions? Yeah.
Are you asking just for questions on the ed fund outlook? Or are you asking
Sure, yeah, let's do that, and then we can,
Okay.
Julia can take us through other
I have
documents.
questions on other parts of the discussion, but.
Okay,
not-
no more questions on the outlook. Okay. Do you have a preference on which document we go to next? Or do you have a preference, Julia, on which document? we go to next?
I defer to the committee and what is most helpful.
Okay.
I thought we could briefly walk through what is in 949 as passed by the Committee of Conference to understand all of the pieces and then move to the spreadsheets, but if everyone.
That sounds great. So let's do that.
Okay. So that's the yields and rates. Going back to the fiscal note. Section 2, this amends the exemption within the current law excess spending. So recall, the excess spending adjustment means that monies, education spending above the excess spending threshold is subject to double tax. Under current law, there's one exemption, that's for voter approved principal and interest payments on bonds that were approved prior to July 1, 2024. The Committee of Conference report amends that temporal condition to push it out. So it's all bond payments on bonds approved prior to July 1, 2026 would be exempt from the excess spending threshold. According to data from the bond bank, you'll recall we spoke about this in committee, there are 11 districts that would be eligible for this exclusion, estimated to be approximately 11.6 million in the annual debt service. That said, at least in FY 27, all but one of those school districts sit below the excess spending threshold, so that doesn't mean necessarily 11.6 more in institutions that will impact the amount raised from the excess spending. That's it.
Thank you. So just for kind of, so this would increase spending on other folks if this is also now counted. Can someone just remind me, Chip, we're starting to withhold revenues from the ed fund. When are we gonna start to feel that on property taxes?
I am not the chip expert. I would ask John, and if John doesn't know, I would need to call my colleague Ted.
John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. I don't think we know yet. I mean, I think the program is currently being stood up and applications would need to go through, and then you wouldn't see any effects on the ed fund until retention started. So I don't know how quickly, but it takes a little, it's not immediate.
Thanks, John.
Section 3, same as what you passed out of your committee. This is that technical correction and statewide adjustment. Section 4, same as what you passed out of the House. This is the transfer to the Department of Taxes. This is for the TIP overpayment to the city of Barry for $150,576. This is included in the estimates of the yields and the rate. Section 5, also was included in 949 as passed out of the House. This is that inflation adjustment to the special education census grant. Section 6 and 7, these are new as were passed out of the House. So section 6 and 7, these are the sections that would amend the excess spending adjustment. So essentially the way, I know there's a lot of words on the page, but essentially the way that this would work is so that in FY 28, or taking a step back, we know that the excess spending threshold is calculated by taking the FY 25 average per pupil spending, increasing it by inflation, and then multiplying it by 118%, right? That's current law. That's how the threshold is calculated. And then all of the spending above that threshold is what is subject to double taxation, absent those excluded bond payments. So that's current law. Section 6 and 7 amend that calculation so that in FY 28, the threshold is calculated by still taking the average FY 25 per pupil spend increased by inflation. And rather than multiplying it by 118%, it will now be multiplied by 115.5%. FY 29, that goes down by 1 percentage point, so then it's multiplied by 114.5%. Dependent on what happens with H 955 and the foundation formula, don't want to get ahead of anything. That is the year that the foundation formula is estimated to take effect. So if the foundation formula takes effect, then there no longer is an excess spending penalty or an excess spending threshold because the financing system is completely changed. So what we see here is if the foundation formula does not take effect as is contemplated in H 955, then what happens? And per the 949 construct, what would happen would be the excess spending threshold would continue, and it would continue to decrease over a couple of years until it flattened out. So in FY 30, it would decrease another percentage point down to 113.5. In 31, down to 113. And then in 32, FY 32, it would decrease to 112.5%. And then would continue in perpetuity unless at some point the foundation formula comes into effect and all of the financing changes you've all talked about come into effect, and then none of this no longer applies.
And right now in 955, as the conference committee report has the foundation formula, if we meet the contingencies, being effective for fiscal year 2030.
Correct.
So that we would be essentially wrapped this yield bill construct at 114.5.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
And we know that the base amount in Act 73 increased by inflation would equal the 114.2%.
In 2030?
In every year, like if we take a step back and we think about how much, how the Act 73 base amount, right, is the 15,033 increased by inflation. we can get to that 15,033 by taking the FY 25 average per pupil spend, increasing it by inflation and multiplying it by 114.2%. And that too would bring us to the base.
I have a series of questions. I don't know how you want to handle it. So one of my questions is, it seems to me that there's a bit of an inflation mismatch. So the base number that we're using before we add any of the percentages to get to the threshold is going to be increased by NIPA, which is right now running at like 3 point something. We know that school district budget inflation, the pressure on school districts anyway, is much higher than that because a big percentage is salary increases and benefits increases that are growing faster than general inflation. So is it true that we're putting additional pressure on school districts, not just by lowering that percentage to calculate the threshold, but that the base as well that we're calculating that threshold on is growing slower than the pressure on school district budgets?
I don't think I can answer that. I think that that is really a question for how you identify what are the pressures that are within a school district's control and outside of a school district's control, and that's not my place to say.
But so let me reframe it, and you don't have to answer it. I just want to share my thinking with the committee, like all things being equal, we like to say that, right? Like if all things were equal, if we didn't hire any more staff, we didn't change any programming, we didn't do anything differently, we're going to have healthcare costs that are still, even though we've done a lot of hard work to bring the increases down, those increases are still 7+ percentage points a year. And our legacy contracts and all of that with our staff and our teachers and our administrators, and most districts are going up a lot faster than this. So that's my concern, is that we've got pressure to grow school budgets, and the only way to do that to keep within inflation. For example, in one of the 2 districts that I represent, this year we decided to cap ed spending growth at 3.5%, which was the inflation number that we had looked at a couple months before the budget had to be finalized. And that required making cuts. It required cutting teachers, and it required cutting programs and consolidating things. And I think that's true in most places, not every place, but most places. Flat funding or only growing by inflation is really challenging for districts. And so I'm just concerned that there's a bit of a double whammy here. I have a question from a colleague that I got asked on the floor, and I just wanted to make sure that my language was precise when I was answering that question, which is what happens with districts that have reserves already? Do those reserves help them stay below the excess spending threshold?
They could, depending on how the district decided to use those reserves, right? So you think about the way that the excess spending threshold works is it's comparing a district's per weighted pupil spending to the threshold. And the way that that per weighted pupil spending is calculated is by taking a district's total education spending and dividing it by its weighted pupil count. Going deeper into that formula, the education spending is calculated by taking the district's total budget and subtracting its offsetting revenues, which of course is categorical aid from state and local, from federal and state government, but could also include a district pulling monies from reserve. So a district could choose, if they had significant reserves, to pull money from the reserve to use as offsetting revenues, assuming that the reserve dollars were permitted to be used in such way, to decrease their overall education spending, which could help them to sit either below or closer to the threshold than if those reserve dollars hadn't been used.
And just to make sure I'm clear, none of the reserves were taken into account when we were looking at this. Just trying to think through how the spreadsheet would have been created.
Sure, so so happy to talk about the spreadsheet. Rep Kimball did a perfect job walking through it this morning. So I don't. I'm happy to each column again if that would be helpful.
And before you say, I just want to jump in with a few things. One, it's a reminder that we did put reserve guidance in 955, and so that should be coming soon to address some of what your questions are about, Representative Burkhardt. And also just want to flag, we need to wrap up at 3 for some all the other things. And so just wanted to make sure that everyone that we're getting through all the documents that folks want to look at, and then folks are getting the questions answered. So Representative Holcomb, and then if anyone else who has not asked a question, let's
I
ask.
think the reserve question is really important because, you know, we have districts that because they thought we were getting double-digit increases this year, used their own reserves to cushion themselves. And now we've added one time on top of that. They are in so much trouble next year. And that's arbitrary, who's in that position. So I do think this stuff matters. The other thing I'm not sure, did the Committee of Conference discuss the continued issues in 127 and how that's going to interact with this?
No, but we discussed that in committee at some point.
Not as it relates to excess spending, though. We didn't talk about that in committee. And we also didn't talk about the weights and some of the issues of the weights and how that arbitrarily affects the subject to the excess.
I think we definitely discussed that topic in committee.
We did not do that. I'm sorry, we did not.
So anyone have any questions for Julia?
Well, I'm gonna cede my next question to Bridget, because I agree, I have the same question she has on that.
Do you want me to answer the reserves question? I'm happy to. I think it's quite quick. I would say, the reserves have been accounted for in the sense that reserves that were used to buy down budgets to education spending sit within this column C, the calculation of excess spending, the calculation of education spending. But
my point is that in the out years, there's been no calculation that says like, okay, this is what FY 27 spending is. So yes, that contains some decisions that were made about where they were gonna set at spending based on those reserves. But there was no calculation that went deeper into district budgets to say that here are these reserves that might be used to keep people. This just basically takes straight FY 27 spending and compares it in all future years as if it doesn't change.
yes, that is correct. I did not go into each district's budget and look at what they have reserves.
And folks, we're not here to put Julie Richter on trial, so I want to make sure.
I'm not being
Okay,
I'm just trying to make sure that I can answer questions that colleagues are asking our committee clearly before we have to vote on this. And I'm sorry if it comes across as I'm not, Julie, you know, I respect you and adore you and think you do amazing work. I'm just trying to make sure that I can represent your work clearly when people ask me questions about it, which will happen. Another question I have is a question that I've probably asked the wrong people a couple of times, but I wanted to clarify it with you. In this whole construct that we're trying to ramp down to the base amount in the foundation formula, 15,033. My understanding is that when districts get a payment under the foundation formula, they're going to get that 15,033 with all the weights applied, you know, based on their pupils. And then there'll be categorical grants as well. And that will be part of this whole payment that districts are getting from the Ed Fund. Is that correct?
That depends on future policy decisions, right? So what we have right now established in Act 73 is the education opportunity payment, which is correct. That is the base amount multiplied by the weighted student count. Act 73 and Act H 955 further amend the small and sparse by necessity, small school grants, sparse school grants, which would fit next to the education opportunity payment. There's also language in H 955 about school construction aid. So there are pieces that are being worked on. To the extent that there will be additional categorical aid going to school districts in addition to the education opportunity payment, still depends in part on outstanding policy choices of what those categorical aid programs would be. How the amount of funds attributed to the categorical aid, how those funds are distributed. So what the future funding state looks like, we don't know until all of those choices have been made.
Can you remind me which choices we've left open last year in addition to the 15? Was it just small and sparse? I thought it was more than that. I thought there were other things that we had not quite accounted for example, CTE funding and things like that, that we had not really factored into that 15,033.
Oh, yeah, I would say there are a host of outstanding policy choices, regarding the foundation formulas, certainly. So school construction, I know that's been worked on significantly in H 955. CTE, the report that JFO is contracting, working on right now is looking at a special education weighting and geographic cost differences and differences. I'm totally talking about the mountain
Transportation.
transportation, and those are issues that haven't been decided how they'll be funded or if they will be funded or by how much.
So that's my concern, because we've been talking about how, all year long, we've been talking about how you can't compare current ed spending to future state spending because they're apples to pomegranates. And my worry is that in this idea that we're ramping from current spending down to the foundation formula, we're trying to ramp from apples to pomegranates. We're trying to ramp total ed spending right now for people down to a lower number that's ignoring some of these other policy choices that we need to make.
That's not my place to say one way or the other. Those are policy choices.
Can we just confirm what was?
Representative Holcomb, do you have a question?
Yes, I do, please, thank you. When Professor Colby came in and presented draft numbers last year, it wasn't based on recent data, it was based on projecting forward based on inflation from previous analysis. What was the base year of data that was used to generate those forward projections for the purpose of estimating 1530?
I do not remember off the top of my head. I'm happy to share that memo back around with the committee.
And it was the 127 data that she was projecting forward?
No, it was by the 127 data, do you mean the data that went into the pupil weights that were adopted in 127?
Projecting forward from that study?
In part, the methodology was used and she received new years of data on top of the data that was used in that 127 study.
So that would be great if you can send that to us.
But for the committee, why it matters is we have passed new legislation, which also creates new implications for school budgets. And if we're using data and just projecting forward, we're now ratcheting people down to a number that is based on pre-policy decision data, just the same.
And we have a study coming back in December that's updating those numbers much more, again, comprehensively. Anyone else have any other questions about these documents?
Although I know that
I have one more.
she has one last.
Yeah, absolutely. You don't, Carol, you don't need to, it's okay.
I just want to be clear. And I'm kind of making an assumption based on how the spreadsheet is laid out, that there were no assumptions made about changes to long-term weighted average daily membership into the out years. So we're assuming, just for purposes of the exercise, that LTW ADM stays the same all the way up.
I appreciate the questions. I think it would be helpful to sort of take a step back and say what these spreadsheets are and are not capturing. As Rep. Kimball mentioned on the floor today, JFO cannot estimate future school district decisions. And we are not able to forecast the weighted pupil count in the state going forward, unless we were to undertake a significant amount of work, would probably need more resources. So to that said, we were asked, we want to see what it would look like if the excess spending threshold were calculated differently in FY27 as a way to wrap our heads around the kind of changes that are being contemplated. And so what you're looking at here is not a forward projection. It is not an estimate of what the excess spending threshold will look like in fiscal year 28, fiscal year 29. It's simply saying in fiscal year 2027, the excess spending threshold is calculated using 118%. This is that threshold amount. There's 8 districts that are over the threshold, and they're over the threshold at a sum amount of 4.3 million. If the threshold in FY27, using FY27 education spending, FY27 long-term weighted ADM, to your point, were calculated using a different percentage, what would the impacts be? And that is all this is capturing.
Thank you for clarifying that. I just wanted to be clear because school spending is often a step function. it can't be ratcheted down pupil by pupil by pupil. It's a chunk of pupils go away and then some spending can go away. And so my concern is that we're underestimating how many school districts are potentially going to hit the excess spending threshold as it ratchets down, because there are all these pressures on school budgets and also declining long-term weighted ADM in a lot of these districts. And so I'm just worried that we're underestimating, and not saying that you did a bad job or that you did anything that you were asked to do. I'm just saying that when you do an analysis, you say sort of where the sensitivities are and where the potential challenges are. And to me, that's a potential challenge of looking at this.
Yeah, and I guess I would follow up and I would say, I don't see this as being an underestimate because this is not a future projection. This is saying if the threshold were calculated in FY 27 using a different percentage, here is what it would look like. And so if the threshold were to have been changed for FY 27, these are what those impacts.
I understand what you're saying.
Thanks, Julie.
Julia, can you walk me, we don't have our handy dandy Ways and Means calendar chart in this room. Could you?
I never knew you appreciated that.
I love the calendar, it's one of my favorites. Could you just remind me, for the, we can't bind the hands of any future legislatures. Folks could come back in January and decide to change pretty much everything that we do here. Could you walk me through? Basically, is there anything that we're doing here that would be too late to change when the legislature reconvenes in January? How much of this is set in stone versus moving? Because I agree completely with Representative Burkhardt that there's a lot of stuff about education transformation that we have not figured out yet, that we have not finalized. And I think that we should be revisiting all of these mechanisms every year to tinker with things as we move forward with transformation. So between, you know, the school budgets, the school boards setting their budgets, warning the vote, all of that stuff. What are we locking in here?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I'm gonna try to answer it and then I might call on John to see if he has other thoughts. The first thing that comes to mind is with respect to the excess spending threshold, we know that school districts start to build their budgets in late summer, early fall for the upcoming fiscal year. Right, and the excess spending threshold is calculated and communicated to school districts in the fall. So to the extent that school districts are building their budgets in accordance with what the excess spending threshold is going to be in the upcoming fiscal year, that amount will have been communicated to them prior to the legislature reconvening. School districts vote on their budgets, typically, not always, on town meeting day. And the legislative session starts in early January. So that gives you a couple of months where if there were to be, try to be a change for the same year, and you would want school districts to be able to account for that in the budgets they're putting to voters. Gives you, I don't know, I'm too tired to think of number of weeks right here, but before the vote goes, before the budgets are voted on, they need to be warned and they need to be printed, so you come back up to that. John, do you have any other thoughts on this?
So it did, I think you gave a super helpful,
Wait,
like,
who are you?
I am John Fred with the to remain me, and I think you gave a super helpful, like, pragmatic, practical, on the ground answer. If it's helpful, I'm happy to talk about in just a simple way, the things that are locked in immediately. I would phrase these in terms of effective dates just from the yield bill, if that is helpful.
Yeah, thank you.
So obviously the yields themselves are for FY 27, so that's a lock-in. But a couple of things that stand out is not locked, you know, I won't speak to the pieces that are effective July 1, 2026. Those are obvious. The yields for FY 27, the technical fixes related to the refund and those pieces. But for the excess spending exemption extension, that's from that July 1, 2024 to July 1, 2026. That doesn't kick in until FY 28, but there's time to think more about that. And I think it's also paired with discussions around the legacy debt aid piece, which of course isn't effective until the foundation formula itself. So you might expect some continued discussion there. For the future excess spending thresholds, that schedule of the 115.5 down to potentially 112.5, but that should just be 114.5. If you go to foundation formula, that doesn't kick in until FY 28. There's still time on those pieces. And obviously, even once you start that schedule, there's still time for falling out years. The renter credit expansion would go ahead and happen. That's kind of locked in. The circuit breaker expansion isn't until 2028, although I don't expect people to have different feelings about that. And then the tuition piece related to FY 28 through 32, again, you would have time to think on this meeting, so.
If we can do one follow-up
Yep.
before, Beth St. James. Oh, I'm sorry, I assume this is for Beth St. James. Can you remind me when the merger committee reports are due back to us?
Yes, at St. James Office of Legislative Counsel, you're gonna get a preliminary, or like your first report back in February of 27 with membership and any information that's available at that time. You're gonna get another report in December 1st, 20.
So.
You're gonna get an interim report in 27. At the very end of the year, after the merger committees have finished their work, when a vote has not happened yet. And then you're gonna get a final report in December of 28 with kind of all the lay of the land after the dust is settled.
Right, so because I imagine that, you know, when these merger committees are doing their work, they're going to be looking at things such as what their long-term rated ADM would be theoretically under a merged district, what that average per pupil spend would end up at in that merged district.
You don't even have to imagine they're required to, I believe.
Sure,
Get a lot of
either
research,
way,
yeah.
either way, those are things that are going to be on the table. And we will have time to adjust these numbers at least post FY 29 as we're receiving all of that information put into many years of education transformation. Point is, we have time to check back on all of these things and adjust them further if these numbers on this paper do not work 2 years from now.
Thank you. I think we need to wrap now to get to our next.
Can I just say one thing? I mean, I feel like I have to just respond to that. And it's very awkward when someone's always in the chair because you don't get a chance to talk as a committee. So this is not about you, Julia. But if we all recall, this year, there was a very substantial data error at the Agency of Education around the long-term rated ADM in a district. They had to put a budget together using that incorrect number, and they discovered it too late to correct. Districts are already talking now about what they're going to cut. This affects, it may not be, we may be able to come back and change the law, but we can't change the fact that they are going to start having impacts locally the minute we start passing this. I've been hearing already about districts that are losing teachers. I'm going to New Hampshire because the policy environment is more stable. They can't take the risk if they don't know what's coming, and people who can move far. So this is going to affect districts. And, you know, I'm not saying yes or no. I'm just saying we should never assume that the decisions we make, particularly punitive decisions, are not having an impact on real people and other people's children. So this will have an impact, even if we go back and fix things after the fact.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Holcomb. Thank you, everyone. I want to take this moment to thank you all for an incredible, vital, productive, somewhat wild biennium, and take another moment to really appreciate all of our staff with extra appreciation for Sorcia who did not catch the last 6 staff appreciations.